2 weeks ago, something happened in the American real estate market that should make anyone thinking about buying a house in 2026 stop and completely reconsider. Mortgage rates climbed again, now hovering around 7% for a 30-year mortgage. Home prices remain stubbornly high. Affordability is at its worst level in 40 years. And inventory is starting to pile up in markets that were previously overheated. While real estate agents and home builders are desperately trying to convince people that now is always a good time to buy, I was looking at the real numbers. And those numbers tell me that 2026 will be one of the worst years in modern history to buy a house. Let me be absolutely clear about what's happening. The average American now needs to spend nearly 40% of their gross income to afford the monthly mortgage payment on a median-priced home. 40%. That's higher than during the 2006 housing bubble that led to the financial crisis. Back then, at least people could get subprime mortgages with low teaser rates. Today, even with perfect credit and 20% down, you're paying 7% interest on home prices that are inflated 50 to 100% above pre-pandemic levels. The math simply doesn't work unless you believe your salary will double in the next few years or interest rates will magically fall by half. You see, I've spent 7 decades studying real estate cycles, and they always follow the same pattern. First comes euphoria, when prices are rising and everyone's afraid of missing out. Then comes denial when warning signs appear, but all the experts say this time is different. Then comes capitulation, when buyers finally realize they overpaid and can no longer sustain the payments. We're now between denial and capitulation. You can see it in the data. The time homes stay on the market is increasing. Price reductions are becoming more common. New home sales have fallen to the lowest levels since the financial crisis, excluding the pandemic lockdown. Here's what really scares me about the housing market. It's supported by a combination of factors that are all starting to reverse simultaneously. During the pandemic, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to nearly zero. The government handed out trillions in stimulus checks, and people stuck at home decided they needed more space. This created a perfect storm of demand that pushed prices to insane levels. Now the Fed has raised rates to the highest level in 2 decades. Government stimulus is over. Remote work is receding as companies force people back to offices, and buyers are finally realizing they can't afford these houses. When all the winds that were at your back turn against you at once, bad crashes happen. Charlie Munger told me something years ago that I never forgot. He said the easiest way to avoid trouble is to avoid buying things you can't afford with money you don't have based on assumptions about the future that are probably wrong. The housing market in 2026 is exactly that. People stretching themselves financially to the limit, taking on massive debt at high interest rates, betting that prices will never fall and that they'll always be able to make the payments. I've seen this movie before in 2006. I saw it in 1989. I've seen it in every major housing bubble of the last century, and it always ends the same way, with many people losing a lot of money, facing foreclosure, and realizing too late that they bought at the peak of an unsustainable market. The question isn't whether the housing market will correct, it's when and how severe it will be. Let me tell you a story about housing markets that perfectly explains why I'm so worried about 2026. In 2005, I was in Omaha watching the California housing market go completely insane. Modest homes in ordinary neighborhoods were selling for $800,000, $1 million, $1.5 million. People were buying multiple properties with zero down, expecting to flip them for profit within 6 months. Real estate agents were saying you couldn't lose because they're not making more land. Economists were explaining that home prices never fall nationally, and then it happened. Prices started falling in 2006, slowly at first, then accelerating through 2007 and 2008 until the collapse became an avalanche. What makes the current situation potentially worse is that this time we don't have as many obvious subprime mortgages to blame. Lending standards are tighter, at least on paper. But here's what people don't understand. You don't need subprime mortgages to have a housing collapse when prices are fundamentally misaligned with people's ability to pay. When a median-priced home requires 40% of gross income at a time when savings rates are low, consumer debt levels are high, and job security is deteriorating, you have a setup for collapse regardless of lending standards. The credit quality of borrowers is irrelevant if they simply can't afford the payments. Let's talk about interest rates, because this is at the heart of why 2026 will be brutal. The Federal Reserve raised rates from nearly 0 to over 5% in just 2 years, the fastest increase in 4 decades. Mortgage rates followed, going from 3% during the pandemic to 7% now. People don't appreciate what this does to purchasing power. At 3% interest, you could borrow $400,000 and have a monthly payment of about $1,680. At 7% interest, that same monthly payment only lets you borrow $250,000. Your purchasing power dropped 40% just because of higher interest rates. The Federal Reserve has signaled that rates will remain elevated longer than most people expect. Inflation is still above their target. The economy has proven surprisingly resilient, which means they have no urgency to cut rates. And even when they eventually do cut, mortgage rates likely won't return to the 3% pandemic era. Those levels were abnormal, a distortion caused by emergency central bank intervention. Normalization means mortgage rates staying around 5 to 6% for years. So if you're waiting for rates to fall to make housing affordable, you'll be waiting a long time. And while you wait, you'll keep paying rent and watching home prices potentially fall. Here's what really bothers anyone studying housing markets rationally. Sellers haven't yet accepted the new reality. Many homeowners bought or refinanced during the pandemic at rates of 2.5% to 3.5%. They're locked into these homes because moving means giving up a cheap mortgage and taking on a new one at 7%. This created an artificial supply lock that kept prices high even as affordability collapsed. But this lock can't last forever. Life happens. People lose jobs, get divorced, need to relocate for work, face financial emergencies. As more forced sellers enter the market and realize buyers simply can't afford the prices they want, price cuts will accelerate. And once price cuts start on a large scale, they feed on themselves as more homeowners panic and try to sell before prices fall further. Now let's talk about something nobody in the real estate industry wants to admit. Demographics are working against the housing market in ways that can't be ignored. Baby boomers, the largest generation in American history, are aging, and many will need to downsize or move to assisted care over the next 5 to 10 years. That means millions of large suburban homes hitting the market. Meanwhile, millennials, who were supposed to be the next wave of buyers, are burdened with student loan debt, earn less than their parents adjusted for inflation, and many have simply given up on the dream of home ownership. Generation Z behind them is even more skeptical about home ownership, preferring flexibility to stability. Let me put this in concrete numbers, because numbers don't lie. The median age of a first-time home buyer in the United States is now 36 years old, the highest ever recorded. It used to be 29 years a generation ago. People are waiting longer to buy because it takes longer to save the down payment and qualify for a mortgage they can afford. But here's the problem. The longer you wait, the more homes boomers will put on the market, and the fewer buyers there will be to absorb that supply. This fundamental supply-demand dynamic isn't something interest rates or government policies can fix. It's simple demographic math, and it points to lower prices, not higher. There's also the question of location that's changing dramatically. During the pandemic, everyone talked about the urban exodus. People fleeing New York, San Francisco, and other expensive cities for places like Austin, Boise, Phoenix, and Miami. This drove prices in these secondary markets to absurd levels. Homes in Boise worth $250,000 in 2019 were selling for $550,000 in 2021. But now that remote work is receding and people realize Idaho in winter isn't as charming as it seemed during a summer of Zoom calls. Some of these markets are seeing significant price pullback. Buyers who paid peak prices are underwater, owing more on their mortgages than their homes are worth. Traditional urban markets face their own serious challenges. San Francisco has seen its financial district emptied as tech companies cut office space and adopted permanent remote work. Commercial real estate is imploding, which erodes the tax base, leads to degraded city services, increases crime, and makes the city less desirable to live in. New York hasn't fully recovered from the pandemic, with many luxury apartments sitting empty while owners refuse to accept that the market has changed. Miami and other Florida cities that saw pandemic rushes now face massive homeowners, insurance increases due to hurricanes, making some owners realize the real cost of owning there is much higher than they anticipated. Every major market has its own specific problems, but the common theme is the same. Prices too high sustained by temporary circumstances that have already reversed. Here's what particularly worries me about buying in 2026. You'll be buying at the tail end of one of the biggest home price booms in history, financed with one of the highest mortgage rates in decades, at a time when demographic and economic headwinds are all aligning against you. If home prices fall even 15 or 20% over the next few years, which is entirely plausible, you'll immediately be underwater on your mortgage. You'll owe more than the house is worth. And with a 7% mortgage, you can't just refinance your way out of trouble like people could when rates were falling. You'll be stuck in a house worth less than you paid, paying high interest on debt that exceeds the value of the asset. That's not building wealth. That's destroying wealth slowly over 30 years. Let's talk about the hidden costs of home ownership that are dramatically worsening and that nobody mentions when they're trying to sell you the American dream. Property taxes are rising rapidly across the country as municipal governments struggle with budgets and inflated assessed values during the boom. In states like Texas and New Jersey, property taxes can easily run $10,000 to $15,000 per year on a middle-class home. That's $1,000 to $1,200 per month just in taxes before you even pay your mortgage, insurance, or maintenance. And these taxes don't fall when home values drop. They just keep rising because governments need revenue. Homeowners insurance has become a crisis in itself that's making certain areas essentially uninsurable at reasonable prices. California is seeing insurers leave the entire state due to wildfire risk. Florida faces premium increases of 100 to 200% in some counties due to hurricanes. Louisiana can barely find insurers willing to cover properties after years of major storms. And it's not just coastal or disaster-prone states. Insurance premiums are rising nationally due to construction cost inflation and changing weather patterns. A home that cost $1,500 per year to insure might now cost $3,000 or $4,000. That's another $250 to $300 per month added to your ownership cost. Maintenance and repairs are another area where people drastically underestimate the real costs. The rule of thumb was to budget 1% of the home's value annually for maintenance. On a $500,000 home, that's $5,000 per year. But that rule was developed when homes cost less and labor was cheaper. Today, with construction cost inflation and shortages of skilled labor, maintenance costs are much higher. Replacing a roof can cost $20,000 to $30,000. A new HVAC system is $15,000. Redoing the driveway is $10,000. And these aren't luxuries, they're necessities that inevitably come up. People buy a house at the limit of their budget and then are shocked when they discover they don't have financial capacity to maintain it properly. There's also the opportunity cost of tying all your wealth into a single house. When you put 20% down on a $500,000 home, that's $100,000 that's no longer invested anywhere else. If you had put that $100,000 in an S&P 500 index fund and achieved average returns of 10% per year, you'd have $259,000 after 10 years. But your home equity will be much less because most of your early mortgage payments go to interest, not principal. At 7% interest, in the first 10 years of a $400,000 mortgage, you'll pay about $250,000 in payments, but only $80,000 of that reduces the principal. The rest is interest that enriched the bank. Here's the reality the real estate industry never tells you. A house isn't an investment. It's a consumer good that happens to appreciate sometimes. You're not buying a house to make money. You're buying to have a place to live. And when you add up the mortgage, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, utilities, and opportunity costs, the true cost of ownership is vastly higher than the monthly mortgage payment everyone focuses on. In 2026, with home prices high and mortgage rates high, you'll be paying maximum costs for all these things simultaneously. It's not just a bad time to buy financially, it's possibly the worst time in a generation when you consider the complete cost picture. Now let me address the emotional argument people always make about why they need to buy a house. They say rent is money thrown away, that home ownership builds equity, that you need stability to raise children, that it's part of the American dream. I understand these feelings, but feelings don't pay mortgages, and emotion is the enemy of good financial decisions. The truth is that rent isn't money thrown away any more than paying for food, transportation, or any other necessity is money thrown away. You're paying for a place to live. And in 2026, renting is mathematically superior to buying in most markets by a massive margin. Let's do the real math on a typical $500,000 house you're considering buying. With 20% down, you need $100,000. Your $400,000 mortgage at 7% interest will cost about $2,660 per month. Add $1,000 for property taxes, $300 for insurance, and at least $400 for average maintenance over time. You're at $4,360 per month, and that's before utilities, HOA fees, or any improvements. Now, you can rent a comparable house in most markets for $2,500 to $3,000 per month. You're saving $1,300 to $1,800 per month by renting. Here's where it gets really interesting. If you take that $100,000 down payment and the $1,500 monthly savings and invest them in a diversified index fund earning average market returns, you'll build wealth far faster than through home ownership. After 10 years, assuming conservative 8% returns, you'd have approximately $450,000 in liquid invested assets. Meanwhile, the home buyer would have about $80,000 to $100,000 in home equity assuming zero appreciation, and much less if home prices fall. The flexibility of renting also has enormous value. You can move for a better job without selling a house. You can downsize if you lose your income. You're not locked into an illiquid asset that takes months to sell. The stability narrative is particularly misleading. People think owning provides stability, but what it really provides is rigidity. If you buy a house and values fall, you're trapped. If you lose your job, you still owe the mortgage payment or face foreclosure. If your area deteriorates or your life situation changes, you can't just leave. Compare that to renting, where you have a 1-year lease and then complete flexibility. In a rapidly changing economy where companies relocate and opportunities arise unexpectedly, flexibility is worth more than ever. Tying yourself to an expensive house with a 30-year mortgage at 7% interest isn't stability, it's a financial prison. The American dream argument is the most insidious because it appeals to identity and status instead of reason. Yes, previous generations built wealth through home ownership, but they bought homes at 2 to 3 times their annual income with 30-year mortgages at 4 or 5% interest. Today, you're buying homes at 5 to 8 times your annual income with mortgages at 7% interest. The math has completely changed. What worked for your parents or grandparents doesn't work under today's conditions. And frankly, prioritizing social status and cultural expectations over your financial well-being is exactly how people end up bankrupt and stressed. Charlie always told me to think independently and not let social pressure drive major financial decisions. Buying a house in 2026 because it's what's expected of you is possibly the most expensive financial decision you'll ever make. So here we are, and I want you to understand exactly what I'm saying about buying a house in 2026. I'm not saying homeownership is always bad or that you should never buy. What I'm saying is that timing matters enormously, and 2026 is possibly the worst timing in decades. You'll be buying at the top of a historic price boom, financing with the highest mortgage rates in 20 years, at a time when all economic and demographic winds are blowing against you. This isn't building wealth. It's a dangerous experiment with the largest investment of your life that will likely end in regret. The math is absolutely clear when you remove emotions and sales narratives. A $500,000 house with 20% down at 7% interest will cost approximately $1,140,000 over 30 years when you add up all mortgage payments, taxes, insurance, and maintenance. You'll pay over $640,000 in interest alone to the bank. And that assumes you keep the house for the entire 30 years and never refinance or move. Most people sell in 7 to 10 years, which means most of their payments went to interest with very little equity built. Meanwhile, if you rented and invested the difference, you'd have built real investable liquid wealth. What really worries me isn't just the people who will buy at the top, but what happens when the market inevitably corrects. Foreclosures destroy lives. I saw it in 2008. Families who thought they were doing the right thing buying a house lost everything when prices fell, and they could no longer afford the mortgages. Credit scores ruined for years. Life savings evaporated. Marriages ended due to financial stress. And all because they bought at the wrong time based on emotion instead of rational analysis. I don't want to see another generation learn that painful lesson, but I fear that's exactly what's about to happen. My advice is extremely straightforward. If you absolutely must buy a house in 2026, be extraordinarily conservative. Buy much less house than lenders say you can afford. Put down at least 25 or 30% to have some cushion if prices fall. Make sure the mortgage payment is less than 25% of your gross income so you have margin if your financial situation changes. And be psychologically prepared for the possibility that you might be underwater on your mortgage for years. If these conditions seem too restrictive or impossible to meet, then you shouldn't be buying. You should be renting and building savings until the market returns to sanity. But honestly, my real advice is simpler. Don't buy in 2026. Wait, rent. Build your savings. Invest in diversified liquid assets. Watch the housing market over the next 2 to 3 years. When you see foreclosures rising, when you see truly desperate sellers, when you see prices that make sense relative to rents and income, then consider buying. It might take 2 years, it might take 5. But when the correction comes, and it will come, those who waited patiently will have the opportunity to buy quality at reasonable prices with better financing terms. Those who bought impulsively in 2026 will be stuck underwater wishing they had been more patient. I've spent 70 years learning that patience is the greatest advantage in investing. It applies equally to real estate. The time to buy isn't when everyone is buying, it's when nobody wants to buy. And 2026 is definitely not that time.